Today's lesson is the beignet, the pastry that's traveled the world. Hi, everybody. My name's Roger.
And my name is Helen.
And today we're going to talk about pastries. More specifically, we're going to talk about something called the beignet or the beignet. I guess people pronounce it different ways. I've never studied French before. Well, I did a long time ago, but I've kind of forgotten it all. But in this particular case, it's a kind of pastry that is sort of from France. I guess it came from someplace else and passed through France. That happens a lot, like croissants, which did not originate in France. So again, we're going to talk about this special kind of pastry, and people in Taiwan really like their pastries. They like going to the bakery, and I'm sure a lot of our dear listeners know what these are, and they probably find them quite tasty. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's begin our lesson by listening to the first part, and we'll be right back.
The beignet, the pastry that's traveled the world. Our world is filled with unique cultures and cuisines, so it's no wonder that there always seem to be new delicious dishes out there waiting to be discovered. The beignet, a French pastry, is a great example of this. Little known in most of the world, this dessert isn't just delicious, it has an interesting history too.
大家好，标题中我们可以看到名词 pastry， 它指的是油酥糕点或是油酥点心。例如 For breakfast, we had apple pastries at the cafe near our hotel. 早餐时，我们在旅馆附近的咖啡厅吃了苹果酥饼。或者 If I could choose one type of food to eat without ever gaining weight, it would be pastries. 如果我可以选择一种食物吃了不会变胖，我会选糕点。再来，我们介绍名词 cuisine， 它的意思是菜肴或是一国或地区的烹饪烹调法。例如When you travel to Spain, be sure to try the local cuisine. 当你到西班牙旅游时，一定要尝尝当地的菜肴。又或者说 Doris learned how to make cuisines from around the world when she studied to be a chef. Doris 在学习成为一名厨师时，学会了如何制作世界各地的美食。
So today's lesson, titled The Beignet, the pastry that's traveled the world, begins like this. Our world is filled with unique cultures and cuisines. And that is indeed true. Before, when people didn't travel so often, cuisines just stayed in its original country. But when people started traveling, it became easier for different cuisines to travel as well, from its country of origin to other countries around the world. So cuisine is a word that refers to a particular style of cooking. You could talk about French cuisine, you can talk about Italian cuisine, Thai cuisine, and the word cuisine here refers to the way or the characteristics of that culture or that country's particular way of cooking or style of food.
Indeed, last night my wife and I went to a Hakka restaurant and we had some Hakka cuisine. So again, we've got different kinds of cuisine all over the world. So it's no wonder, it's not surprising, that there always seem to be new delicious dishes out there waiting to be discovered. Indeed, if you listen to your friends and you hear word of mouth, we can always find out about a new restaurant that's opened up or a new recipe that's popular on the internet. And indeed, it gives us a great opportunity to try new things that we've never tried before.
Yes, so since the world is filled with so many different cuisines, it's no wonder that there's always something new that you can try. Here, the phrase, it's no wonder that, means it's not surprising that. You can also say it's little wonder that. It means the same as it's no wonder that. It's not surprising that we have so many choices of different cuisines since the world is filled with so many different types of food. I could also say, as an example, it's no wonder that you have a stomach ache. You just had 3 slices of pizza and a hamburger.
Indeed, you would get a stomach ache by eating such foods. But here, the beignet, a French pastry, is a great example of this. So again, we're talking about the beignet in today's program. What is a beignet? Well, it's a French pastry. A pastry is a kind of bread that's cooked in a special way. A loaf of bread for sandwiches would not be considered a pastry, but pastries, of course, are fancy. You eat them one at a time. They're usually kind of sweet, and they have different kinds of fillings. Like a croissant, for example, is a pastry.
Yes. Pastry also means a type of dough that's used to make pastry dishes. So pastry is really a mix of flour, butter, and milk or water. When you mix these things, you create a dough or you create a batter. And you can use that pastry to make other baked goods like pies or apple turnovers, croissants, and all kinds of sweet desserts.
Right. So again, this is a good example of something that has gone around the world, and it's something that people would like to try. Little known in most of the world, this dessert isn't just delicious, it has an interesting history too. So yes, indeed, it's not very known around the world. Some people probably know about this particular pastry, but most people probably don't. But we're saying that it's not only delicious, but also has an interesting history, which we're going to talk about in today's program, exactly where these things came from, and then we're going to talk about how they are made and what they contain, what their ingredients are.
Deep fried, flaky, and served with plenty of powdered sugar on top, the beignet is often called the French donut. There are clear distinctions between beignets and donuts, though. Made with more flour and less egg, beignets have a lighter weight and taste, and they're also usually square-shaped with no hole in the middle. Another big difference is that beignets are simply more obscure. This is surprising when you consider their international history.
第二部分我们看到形容词 flaky， 它的意思是易脆成薄片的或是呈层状的。举例来说 The pastries were light and flaky. 那款酥饼爽口又酥松。接下来我们介绍单字 distinction， 它是名词，意思是区别、差别、不同，也可以是优秀或是卓越的意思。例如 There weren't any notable distinctions between the few houses we looked at. 在我们看的几个房子之间，并没有任何明显的差别。又或者说When one of the twins dyed her hair, the distinction between them became obvious. 当双胞胎中的一位染头发时，他们之间的区别就变得很明显了。再举一个例子 During his time in the military, Arnold won several distinctions. Arnold 在军队服役期间赢得了多项荣誉。再来我们看到形容词 obscure， 它有无名的、鲜为人知的或是费解的、不清楚的意思。例如Ted collects obscure jazz albums. Ted 收集鲜为人知的爵士乐专辑。
So now we're going to look at how beignets are made. Deep fried, flaky, and served with plenty of powdered sugar on top, the beignet is often called the French donut. Now, first of all, we all know what a donut is. A donut is a kind of pastry or a kind of dessert or something that you can eat for breakfast that has a hole in the middle, and it's usually fried sometimes. I don't know if it can be baked, but it's usually fried, I think. So the beignet is very similar to the donut. The beignet is deep fried, which means that it's cooked under the surface of hot oil. It's not just lying on top of hot oil, but it's completely immersed in hot oil. That's how you deep fry something. And the beignet is also flaky, which means that it has a consistency that's very loose. When you eat it, when you bite into it, little pieces might fall off and fall on your lap, so you have to put a plate under your mouth when you eat it so that you don't get it all over you. That refers to a flaky type of food.
Yeah, it has a lot of thin layers and it creates a lot of crumbs there. And they also serve it with lots of powdered sugar on top. Sugar can be granular, but if you grind it more finely, then it's powdered sugar. Just like you can have powdered cinnamon, and you can add that to your coffee or even pastries. I think some pastries have ground cinnamon. In this particular case, we've got powdered sugar on top, and we're also calling it the French donut. And again, a donut is something that's deep fried, just like the beignet. And I should say that sometimes you see the spelling of donut as D-O-N-U-T, but the formal spelling is D-O-U-G-H-N-U-T.
Yes, so there are some similarities between donuts and beignets. But there are also clear distinctions between beignets and donuts, though. And distinction, of course, means a difference, a clear difference between two things that are similar. So I might say that Spanish and Italian often sound similar to one another, but there are clear distinctions between these two languages.
Exactly. There's differences between them, and indeed, the French are probably going to say, how could you possibly compare beignets to donuts? That's a vulgar comparison, but for the rest of the world, we do think they're kind of similar, but there are some distinctions between them. There are some differences. Made with more flour and less egg, beignets have a lighter weight and taste, and they're also usually square-shaped with no hole in the middle. So we're describing exactly how they're made and how they're prepared. We've got more flour in them than we have in donuts, and we have less egg in the dough for beignets. And again, they have a lighter weight and taste. They're not so heavy like donuts are, and they're usually square-shaped with no hole in the middle, and donuts are round-shaped and they have a hole in the middle.
That's right. And another big difference is that beignets are simply more obscure. So if you want to compare donuts and beignets, you could say that donuts are more popular, whereas beignets are more obscure. When something is obscure, it's not well known. I could say, for instance, that Van Gogh was an obscure painter when he was alive, and he became famous only after his death. The word obscure also means dark. If something is covered by a cloth, for instance, or it's shielded from light from the sun, you can say that it's very obscure.
But obscure here is an adjective, but it could also be a verb, which means to block the sight of something. I could say the sun is obscured by clouds today. I can't see the sun at all. But again, these particular kinds of pastries are kind of obscure. They're kind of rare. You don't really see them everywhere. And this is surprising when you consider their international history. They've had a history of being in lots of different countries. So it's kind of surprising to find out that they are kind of obscure and not a lot of people know about them. Indeed, you're probably not going to see them at your local bakery in your neighborhood. But if you go to a fancy bakery in a department store or something like that, they probably sell them there. Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson for today. Let's move on now to the third and final part.
Though it's considered a French pastry today, historians have traced the beignet back to a similar pastry made in ancient Rome. Furthermore, many believe the word beignet comes from the ancient Celtic word bigne, an indication that the Romans got their recipe from the Celts. From Celtic to Roman to French culture, the beignet has certainly traveled the world. But to become fully acquainted with beignets, one must follow the trail of beignet crumbs to one more place, New Orleans.
第三部分我们看到单字 indication， 它是名词，指的是表明、显示或是暗示，也可以是迹象。例如 Poor grades are an indication of poor study habits. 成绩不好是学习习惯不良的迹象。最后介绍一个名词 recipe， 它有食谱或是烹饪法的意思。例如 Ken shared a great recipe for fried chicken with his friend. Ken 和他朋友分享了一份很棒的炸鸡食谱。最后一个例子 The next step in the recipe is to add 1 cup of milk. 食谱中的下一步是加1杯牛奶。
So now we're going to look a bit at the history of beignet. Though it's considered a French pastry today, historians have traced the beignet back to a similar pastry made in ancient Rome. So we could say that the modern beignet has its roots in ancient times.
Indeed. So we're talking again about some history of the beignet, and they've traced it back to a similar pastry made back in ancient Rome. So they've traced it back, they've done some research, and they followed the line of history back in time, and they looked at some records and they found out, ooh, they had this pastry back in Rome, or at least the Romans had a pastry that was similar to the pastry we know today as the beignet. And furthermore, or in addition, also, many believe, or many people believe, the word beignet comes from the ancient Celtic word beignet. I hope I said that right. And that is an indication that the Romans got their recipe from the Celts. Now, the Celts were people who lived in Europe before the Romans, and of course, we know the Celts by their knots. If you've ever seen these knotting patterns, that's what they're most known for, and those people lived in Europe a long time ago. Some people say Celts, but I think you're supposed to say Celts. The C there has a hard K sound there, and the adjective for the Celts is Celtic. Sometimes you can hear Celtic music on the internet.
Right, so based on the word beignet and the fact that it's very similar to the Celtic word, that becomes an indication, or the similarity is an indication that the Romans got their recipe for beignet from the Celts. So an indication here is a sign that shows what might be true, what could have happened. And the fact that beignet sounds like this ancient Celtic word is a sign or an indication that this recipe actually came from the Celts. And recipe here is a set of instructions that people use to cook a particular type of food. So if you want to know how to make, let's say, lasagna, and you've never made it before, then you might go on the internet and look for a recipe so that you can follow this recipe to make lasagna.
And moving on to the next sentence, it says, from Celtic to Roman to French culture, the beignet has certainly traveled the world. Indeed, it has been part of many different cultures. The Celts had it, the Romans had it, the French have it, probably the Swedes have it, and the Russians have it, or even the Italians have it. Who knows? It's probably all over the place in Europe now and in the rest of the world. They most certainly will have it in Japan. They love their pastries there. And, of course, it's traveled the world, and it's probably even made its way here to Taiwan.
Yes, but to become fully acquainted with beignets, one must follow the trail of beignet crumbs to one more place, New Orleans. And that is certainly a surprise because we associate beignets with European food, but actually beignets are very popular in a particular part of the United States, New Orleans, which is a city in Louisiana in the south, in the southern part of the United States.
Right, and some people say New Orleans, but you're supposed to say New Orleans, or some people say NOLA, New Orleans, Louisiana. But in this particular case, again, as you said, Helen, this is a city in the southern United States known for its French culture or French influence, which we're going to get to in our next program. And here we've got the word crumbs, and those are just little pieces of bread that fall off some kind of pastry. And indeed, if the pastry is very flaky or it's very dry, then you're going to get lots of crumbs. And that's not good. Don't eat pastries in bed because you're going to have a lot of crumbs, which will attract roaches and ants. At least that's what happens in my house.
Yes, and here the writer uses the phrase, you should follow the trail of beignet crumbs to refer to another story. I think it was a fairy tale or a myth where somebody was leaving crumbs on the ground so that they wouldn't get lost, they wouldn't lose their way. And that was a way for them to get back to where they came from. But unfortunately, the birds or some insects ate the crumbs and they couldn't find their way back anyway. So this is some kind of reference to that story. And here we're talking about following the beignet crumbs, because if you want to understand the full history of the beignet, then you have to also also go to New Orleans.
Right, so you follow a trail of crumbs. Of course, the crumbs aren't actually there, but we're using this in a metaphoric way. You could find those crumbs along the way and do some research in New Orleans and figure out what happened to the beignet there. Okay, that brings us to the end of our explanation for today. Let's listen now to Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第二部分有一句写到 Made with more flour and less egg, beignets have a lighter weight and taste. 这个句子呢，它有使用到分词构句，它其实是由 beignets are made with more flour and less egg, and they have a lighter weight and taste. 它就是省略了连接词，然后省略了前半句的主词，动词部分呢只保留过去分词 made 所简化而来。那么前半句的这个分词构句 made with more flour and less egg 就是在描述这个贝涅饼以较多的面粉和较少的蛋做成的。好，这边我们就来补充几个可以表达由什么什么做成，由什么制成的那种用法。第一个呢 be made with 就是像课文用法咯，用来说明所含的原料成分。那这个句型并没有强调制作过程，常常用来描述食材的原料。举例来说 The cake is made with layers of cream and berries. 这个蛋糕是由好几层的鲜奶油和莓果制成的。好，那第二个表达用法是 be made of 是用来说明构成的材质原料。那你从成品外观是看得出它制作原料的，就像木桌、石椅，你都知道它们是什么做的，从外观就看得出来。举例来说 The dresser is made of wood. 那个衣柜是木质的。好，第三个用法是 be made from， 它可以用来说明产品的来源，你从成品外观看不出原料，或者是说呢，从制作原料到成品，它的本质已经改变了。举例来说 The wine is made from organic grapes， 这种酒是用有机葡萄制成的。好，同样在课文第二部分有提到贝涅饼和甜甜圈，另一个大的差别就是贝涅饼根本就比较鲜为人知。好，文中它用到 obscure 这个形容词来形容无名的、鲜为人知的。那我们要拆解它的字首字根。好，先看到 ob 这个字首呢，它有朝向、在什么什么上方，或者是反对，或者是阻碍的意思。在 obscure 这个字当中，它的字首 ob 表示在上方，那么 scure 这个部分表示覆盖，合在一起 obscure 当动词具有遮掩、遮蔽，使什么难以理解的意思。那么当成形容词来用，就可以形容是难以理解的、鲜为人知的。好，顺便补充两个相同字首的单字。第一个是 obstacle，它的字首 ob 表示阻挡，那么字根 sta 表示站立， cle 则是拉丁文名词字尾。好，站在那边阻挡、挡住的东西呢，就是障碍物嘛。obstacle 这个名词就表示阻碍、障碍或是障碍物咯。好，第二个补充呢是 obey， 它的字首 ob 表示朝向， ey 是聆听，合在一起 obey 就有听从、遵从、服从的意思咯。好，那么以上这件重点整理，我们回顾这些单字吧。
Pastry. The bakery sells pies, cakes, rolls, and various other pastries. Cuisine. Faith's favorite cuisines are Japanese, Thai, and Italian. Distinction. Denise easily saw a distinction between the two shades of blue. Obscure. Steve only likes obscure movies that most people have never heard of. Indication. The CEO gave a strong indication that he would be resigning. Recipe. My mom has a great recipe for chicken soup.
Well, everyone, today's article has come to an end, and I sure hope you enjoy reading along with us. I am Helen.
I am Roger.
See you next time.